U.S. Chapter 18, Section 2, the movement gains ground. How did the civil rights movement gain ground in the 1960s? So we'll look at a couple different things: sit-ins, freedom rides, Meredith actions during the 1960s. We'll look how protests at Birmingham and the March on Washington were linked to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then what are the parts of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? What did it kind of cover? What didn't it cover? What things were maybe missing that still needed to be taken care of? So when we look at sit-ins, inspired by the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, what you get is young people around the country, in particular probably college students, upper high school students, are inspired. And what they want to do is they want to do their part. And so one of the things that they want to see done is the desegregation of Woolsworth. And so Woolsworth is this franchise store. It did multiple different things. It kind of was like a pharmacy convenience store on one part of it, but they also had lunch counters in there as well. And so African American students could go in and buy pencils and those types of things, but they weren't necessarily allowed, or they weren't allowed to be able to eat at the lunch counters. So what these students decide to do is, it starts with just a handful of students, and they decide that they're going to sit at the lunch counter until they are served. The first day they're not served, and what ends up happening is this thing kind of gains steam, and it gains momentum, and all of a sudden you get more and more, and next thing you know, what you have is you have students sitting there, and as one student has to go to class, another student will take their place, and it pretty much shuts down this lunch counter, and eventually the lunch counter realizes that they're going to lose business. They're not going to be able to continue to function as a lunch counter, and they decide that they're going to integrate. And this is going to start spreading across the country. So not only are you going to have lunch counter sit-ins, you're going to have library sit-ins. Just wherever there's segregation, you're going to see these sit-ins begin to take place. With that, what the civil rights movement realizes is we need to have some kind of an organization. We have this young, energetic group, but they really don't have any way to give it kind of direction or leadership or form. So you get SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee form. And what they're going to do is they're going to tap into this youth movement, and they are going to help direct it and put it where it needs to go, and teach kids how to curl up in a ball to protect your vital organs when you're getting beat and kicked and all that type of stuff. And when you look at why is it that the young people are really getting involved here, well, there's a couple of factors. One is, 1954 was Brown versus Board of Education. Many of these kids were still going to fully segregated schools, and nothing had changed over the course of 6 years. And it really looked like nothing was going to change over the course of the next 10 or 15 or 20 or 30. And so that quote there, that most of us will be grandparents before we can live normal lives, these kids had the most to gain, and without families, that you had to provide for, they had the least to lose. And so that's really why they're getting involved and taking part in this. So with the success of that, the next target is segregation in the South. And they're very thoughtful in how they approach this. The first thing that they're going to do is they're going to attack interstate travel. So this travel that takes place from state to state to state, because if we remember Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that if people wanted to travel within the state of just Louisiana, that was perfectly okay to segregate. Now, once you cross state borders, that all bets are off. And so what the Freedom Riders are going to do is they're going to get on buses that go from the north into the deep south. And when they get to these bus stops, they're going to go into the whites-only bathrooms. They're going to drink from the whites-only drinking fountains. They're going to sit in the whites-only waiting areas, because segregation cannot have a law when you're traveling between states. One state's law can't interfere the travel or whatever of another state. And so what's going to happen is in Alabama is where they're really going to run into trouble. One of the buses firebombed. One of the bus people get on and make all the riders get off, and then they beat them, some of them almost to death. They leave them hospitalized. This forces President Kennedy to do something. The violence is too much. And so Kennedy gets involved. He talks to the leaders in Mississippi and says, here's the deal. You either need to protect those bus riders, or I'll send the U.S. military in to protect those bus riders. Now, he also struck a little bit of a deal. He said, if these buses get to where they are going and they are safe, you can arrest the protesters for disturbing the violence. So he allowed some of those leaders in Mississippi to save face a little bit, but he did protect them and demonstrated that the federal government's willing to get involved. This is going to inspire further action. So we've got Meredith, who is an Air Force veteran. He wants to go to the University of Mississippi, or he wants to integrate the University of Mississippi, and he announces this. And pretty soon what happens is he receives an awful lot of death threats. And so again, Kennedy has to send protection in to keep him safe as he registers for classes. This is going to inspire a riot where they are hoping to force Meredith to, or scare him away from actually enrolling at Ole Miss. But he enrolls anyway. 2 were killed, 160 some people were injured during this riot. One of the people who plays a key role in this is Medgar Evers, and Medgar Evers is shot outside of his home in front of his family, in large part because of the role he played in getting Meredith enrolled in Ole Miss. And a few years later, James Meredith is almost killed. He's shot in the back multiple times and left for dead, but he's able to survive those wounds and continue to play a role in the civil rights movement. The next big step is, how do we continue this fight, and how do we make Americans aware of what's going on? And the civil rights movement is going to begin to target some of these worst places. Birmingham, Alabama is considered to be the most segregated city in the United States. They have a police commissioner named Eugene Bull Connor who is willing to use any means necessary to maintain segregation. If that means unleashing the dogs, unleashing the dogs. If it means taking fire hoses, he takes fire hoses. If it means taking billy clubs to 10-year-old kids, he'll take billy clubs to 10-year-old kids. The problem for Bull Connor is that TV is covering all of this. And as Americans are watching, the force, the violence, these nonviolent protesters getting beaten and attacked, it really starts to turn the stomach of Americans across the United States. And public opinion is really beginning to sway and realize that the troublemakers are not the African American protesters. In a lot of ways, they begin to view the police down there as being the ones who are being too extreme, who are being too violent. And that's going to have an impact as things go. And in the letter from the Birmingham jail, what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. does is he illustrates why the civil rights movement is going and picking up steam. In one part of the letter, he mentions that wait has almost always meant never, that they continue to say, wait, it'll come, wait, civil rights will come. And the point that he is making is, in 100 years since the end of the Civil War, not much in the United States, at least in the Deep South, had changed, and it's time for change. With this escalating violence, Kennedy is going to go to the American people on television. He's going to give this speech in 1963 that says, while you are free to disagree with the laws of desegregation, as an American, you are duty bound to follow the law. And so he is really starting to weigh in, and he's going to start pushing for civil rights legislation. But unfortunately, he's assassinated before he's able to really accomplish that. Which leaves his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, to be the person who potentially could end up pushing civil rights legislation through. Inspired by the success, inspired by President Kennedy's intervention, The civil rights movement is going to march on Washington. They're hoping to get 100,000 people, but they end up with twice that. The speeches are taking place at the Lincoln Memorial, which is very fitting. And what they're going to push for is this civil rights bill. They're in support of it, and they're hoping for passage of it. And this is where Dr. Martin Luther King gives his inspirational I have a dream speech. I have a dream that one day the United States will come together as one, and that the issue of race and the issue of color will go away, and that we'll judge people on the content of the character, not on the color of their skin. And this is deeply inspirational, and it's one that's often quoted. In the lead up to the Civil Rights Act, the 16th Street Baptist Church is a place where African Americans are able to register to vote. It's a place where civil rights activists meet and congregate and communicate, and it is targeted by a terrorist in the United States, a KKK terrorist, who blows up the 16th Street Baptist Church and in the process kills 4 young girls who were going to Sunday school. This is going to be kind of the final straw for LBJ. I mean, there's lots of things, but Lyndon Johnson is going to push the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through. Congress is going to stall. They're having a filibuster. It lasts 80 days, this nonstop talking and debating about the bill. Finally, Lyndon Johnson is able to sway a couple of Southern Democrats to end the filibuster, to get a vote on the Civil Rights Act, and it passes. What the Civil Rights Act does do is it bans segregation in all public places. It gives the federal government the power to desegregate schools. It gives the federal government a great amount of authority to prosecute discrimination. The one problem is it doesn't really do much to deal with voting rights. So that's why a little bit later on, 1965, we'll have the Voting Rights Act, because this Civil Rights Act doesn't really address it or doesn't give the federal government enough power to ensure that African Americans have the right to vote.